Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Coffee at the Capitol with Faith in Public Life. Faith in Public Life Action launched our faithful agenda for the Biden administration's first 100 days in February, and it outlines what we hope both the administration and Congress will do to bring justice and wholeness for all people. As people of faith, driven by our values of dignity, love of neighbor, and justice, we demand that our elected officials pass policies that center our communities, meet our needs, reflect our values, and remedy injustice. This includes compassionate, effective pandemic relief for all, providing sustainable equity and ending systemic racism, justice and dignity for LGBTQ people, dignity, family, unity, and citizenship for all immigrants, building an inclusive democracy for all people. Each week, we will join in discussion with faith leaders, local community organizers, and movement partners to dive deeper into the core values of this faithful agenda and learn more about specific legislation that can bring justice to our communities. During all of these discussions, we'll share the most prominent policies that help advocate for our values and the impact they have on women, people of color, LGBT communities, immigrant communities, and people of faith. We'll highlight national and federal policies that can help impact the state and local level, as well as bring awareness to ways that you can take action with us during the weeks to come. Today's topic, which I'm so excited about, is writing LGBTQ equality into law, and we will discuss the intersection of faith and federal non-discrimination protections. We're still in a sacred time of year for many of our traditions. Passover has come to an end, as has Lent and Easter, and we have just entered Ramadan. And many of us are thinking about how our faiths are represented in the work for equality and justice. I'm your moderator, Artie Hartzell. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I'm the advocacy and election strategist at Equality North Carolina, as well as the consultant for federal non-discrimination protections at Faith in Public Life for North Carolina. I'm also a religious studies graduate student at Chicago Theological Seminary with a focus in LGBT studies. I joined the fight for LGBTQ non-discrimination protections in 2015 in Charlotte, North Carolina. In North Carolina, as in 32 other states, our legislature has introduced anti-trans legislation this year. We also know that LGBTQ people of color, particularly Black and brown trans people, have the most urgent needs and are fighting for basic survival. The need for federal protections is urgent. Local protections are also needed in the places federal law cannot meet the need. Currently, some LGBTQ people are protected in the US and can travel to places where they are not protected. That's why we need federal and local protections across the country for all of us. It's a joy and pleasure to be here with three extraordinary individuals with expansive knowledge and experience. Dr. Sabrina Dent, Barbara Satin, and Jacob Greenblatt. Will you please introduce yourselves in that order with your name, pronouns, and professional affiliations?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Sabrina Dent, and my pronouns are she and her, and I am the Senior Faith Advisor at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It is a pleasure to be with you all today.
Greetings from Minnesota. I'm Barbara Satin. I'm the Faith Work Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm looking forward to this wonderful conversation with great people.
Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Greenblatt. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm the Senior Legislative Assistant at the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism. Let me also extend my thanks to Artie and the Faith in Public Life team for their generous invitation to this event. It is such a pleasure to be here with my distinguished fellow panelists today.
Thank you all. And as I said, these are amazing people. I would love to hear in the same order, will you tell us how your personal faith has motivated you to work for LGBTQ justice and equality?
Oh, wonderful. So thank you for that question, Artie. Honestly speaking, every stage in my life points back to working towards justice and equality. I know what it feels like to be marginalized because of my race, because of my gender, and also my religious identity, and sometimes my socioeconomic status. However, it was the faith practiced by my Pentecostal parents who taught us the value of a strong work ethic and modeled love, respect, and kindness through their actions. Every time my father would write me a letter, he would sign off with the scripture from the third epistle of John, verse 2 in the Bible, which reads, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." So for me, this text proclaims that I want the best for those that I love and those that I encounter. And it's more than about their spirit that matters, but their humanity. And so this is a belief that I have embodied in every area of advocacy, which grounds me in my spiritual practice of showing compassion towards every human being. At the same time, it reminds me of my best friend from college, Kevin, and his husband, Joey, who are a same gender loving couple who are devoted people of faith. So for me, when I put a name and a face to an issue, any issue, especially this issue, it motivates me even more to work for the betterment of humanity and to do the work of LGBTQ equality and justice, because it is the right thing to do.
My path has been a challenging one simply because I spent most of my early years, I'm going to be 87 in July, so I spent about 2/3 of my life trying to figure out who I was and what was this situation that I find myself in. Keep in mind that when I was growing up, we had no definitions, we had no dictionary to tell us, no encyclopedias that talked about trans issues. So I just basically hid all of that, trying to figure out how I can live this life, but also be practice my faith. And I finally came, through the help of a loving family and a great therapist, to understand that rather than being cursed by God, I was being blessed by God, and maybe I should try to live my life as a blessing. And that's what I've tried to do. I found a great church that welcomed me, an LGBTQ church that had never had a T person. So that was a great experience for them and for me. But since that connection to the United Church of Christ, I've become very active within that denomination, but then spread that into a national opportunity to do faith work with the National LGBTQ Task Force. And I'm a great believer in the fact that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. So many of the things that we have dealt with or are dealing with take a long time, but we are stepping forward and making progress. When you think about how long it took to reach the Supreme Court decision in 2015, after having lost 13 marriage amendment fights back in 2006, you don't stop working, and eventually you'll get the end result that you were working for. And so I find that true in civic use situations, but also in faith situations, and watching congregations and assemblies and faith settings across the country begin to understand who we are and accept us.
For me, my Judaism has always been deeply connected to social justice. I was tremendously fortunate to grow up at a thriving congregation in North Carolina, where social justice was really always at the forefront of everything we did. On the issue of LGBTQ equality specifically, Judaism is really clear in my mind about the need for full LGBTQ equality. Our Torah teaches in the book of Genesis that everyone is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that each person has the metaphorical spark of the divine within them. We know today everyone is worthy of dignity, respect, and equal treatment under the law, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And this concept is really foundational to all of the work that we do in the reform movement as social justice advocates, this belief that everybody is created in the divine image. Just to add briefly that for centuries, Judaism has really recognized and celebrated a diverse spectrum of sex and gender identities. And this really wasn't something I realized until I started working at the RAC and had the opportunity to get more deeply involved in the connection between policy and Jewish text. Across Jewish legal codes and rabbinic commentary, there are hundreds and hundreds of references to at least 6 different genders. And many of our texts proudly affirm and uplift and cherish the existence of transgender, non-binary, intersex and gender fluid individuals. Something that I think is really beautiful and really compelling and really inspiring for me.
Wow, such powerful answers. I'm so excited to dive deeper into this conversation. Jacob, let's start with you. The Equality Act has been a prominent bill for some time now. If it's passed, what protections would be written into law, and what would this mean for LGBTQ communities?
Sure, that's a great question, Artie, and you touched a little bit on this in your introduction. I'll just add, really at the most basic level, the Equality Act would create federal civil rights protections for LGBTQ people. And despite significant progress over the past several decades, including the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, most people don't realize that there are no federal protections right now for sexual orientation and gender identity. Instead, we have this sort of inconsistent patchwork of state legislation, and most states actually lack explicit protections for LGBTQ people. So the Equality Act would add protections for actual or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity to federal civil rights law in a couple different areas: employment, housing, education, public spaces and services, federally funded programs, credit, and jury service. And the need for these protections is really clear. Due to this state patchwork, as you mentioned, LGBTQ people still face discrimination in many, many areas of life, in healthcare and housing and education, and all those areas that the Equality Act would cover. We also know that LGBTQ people, immigrants, and those with disabilities face even greater discrimination, greater barriers, and greater biases. We also know that hate crimes directed against LGBTQ people are on the rise, and we're continuing to see this really heartbreaking epidemic of fatal anti-transgender violence that really has historically targeted Black and Latinx transgender women. It's also worth noting that all these statistics really don't represent the true extent of the problem, because these types of incidents are often underreported or misrepresented. So the problem is actually probably far greater than what we know. We've also seen in recent weeks state legislatures across the country launching a really unprecedented attack on LGBTQ people, especially transgender people, with dozens and dozens of bills targeting gender-affirming care and trying to ban transgender kids from sports. So the Equality Act would really solve a lot of these problems. It would guarantee federal legal protections for LGBTQ people across the country, ensuring that they don't face discrimination just because their state or their locality doesn't provide civil rights protections or chooses to target certain groups like transgender people with state legislation. I would also say that more broadly, the Equality Act would really send a clear signal that everyone is entitled to live without fear of persecution or harassment or violence.
Thank you, Jacob. That's such a thorough answer, and I really appreciated how you talked about the ways layers of marginalization are, like, people with layers of marginalization would be impacted by the Equality Act. The LGBTQ community is encompassing of people of all kinds of other communities. So thank you so much for that. As a follow-up, we've seen faith used as a justification to reject and discriminate against LGBTQ people, and as a tool to promote injustice and exclusion. I know you talked a little bit in your intro about how your faith calls you to justice. Why is it important to leverage the power of faith to pass legislation like LGBTQ equality in Congress? And how can we do that as faith leaders?
Sure, that's a really wonderful question. Yeah, as I touched on in my introduction, for me as a Reformed Jew, I believe that deep faith and a deep and abiding commitment to LGBTQ equality are not mutually exclusive whatsoever. They're really both essential parts of my faith tradition and of the Reformed Jewish movement's work. And so I find that it's really important to lift up faith voices in this fight for LGBTQ equality. Just to share a bit about the Reform movement's history on LGBTQ rights, we've consistently advocated for LGBTQ equality, beginning in 1965 when our women's affiliate, the Women for Reform Judaism, called for, at that time, the decriminalization of homosexuality. And since then, we've been proud to support all the major advancements in LGBTQ rights over the past several decades. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010, the Supreme Court decisions of Obergefell v. Hodges and Bostock v. Clayton County. In 2015, the reform movement passed historic resolutions affirming the rights of transgender and gender nonconforming people, which at least at that time was the farthest reaching transgender rights resolutions of any major religious denomination in the country. And as we can see from the reform movement work and from this panel, support for LGBTQ equality extends across so many faith traditions. The RAC is really proud to be among 120 plus faith organizations that have endorsed the Equality Act. And we know that according to recent polling from Public Religion Research Institute, more than 70% of religious Americans, including a majority of nearly every major faith group, supports LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. So that sort of binary that you mentioned between faith and LGBTQ equality is really a false binary. To sort of answer, I think, the meat of your question as to why it's important that we stand up for LGBTQ rights as people of faith, it's because LGBTQ people are part of our own faith communities. We know that for too long, our LGBTQ congregants, our clergy, our youth, our neighbors, our community members have lived without the critical safeguards that are available to non-LGBTQ people throughout the country. When I think about LGBTQ equality, and when I think especially about these recent attacks on transgender youth and on gender affirming care, I'm thinking a lot about the young people that I work with at the RAC. I'm so incredibly fortunate in my role to work closely with high school and college students across the reform movement and across a number of Jewish communities, really helping them find their identity as advocates and as organizers and raise their issues, or their voices on the issues that they care about. Over the past few years, I've led several programs on LGBTQ equality, and I'm always really struck by the stories that these students share about the discrimination that they see in their schools and their communities, and many of them that they face as queer teens themselves. And these students, they're so thoughtful, they're so compassionate, they're so resilient, they're so deeply committed to justice. And it's really critical that we as people of faith say to them and to everyone, we see you, we value you, and we're here to fight for your rights.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was such a good answer for both of those questions. I'm gonna go to Barbara now. Barbara, you know, you've been in the struggle, leading the fight for LGBTQ equality for a long time. How have you seen the faith community's view on LGBTQ equality and humanity evolve over the years? And what grounds your resiliency to stay in this fight? Because it's a hard, long one.
It's very true. It is a hard, long one. I guess my resiliency is comes from the fact that I see such progress being made within faith communities, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. And much of it comes from the fact that people finally come to understand who we are. We tell our stories. We have the opportunity now that many of us never had before to let people know who we are, to show the faith that we live and the values that we profess. You know, one of the major criticisms of the LGBT community from the far right is the fact that they call us, you know, non-believers, that we are aimed at trying to bring down religion, where for many of us, it's a quest to try and find a place where we can be welcomed and affirmed within a religious community, because for many of us, that's the way in which we have grown up. For those of us within the LGBT community who have been basically dismissed by our faith communities, we are searching for ways in which we can reconnect. So I see that happening. You know, there are thousands of welcoming and affirming churches and assemblies and temples and synagogues across the country. Many of them are available if people are looking for them on the welcomingresources.org website of the National LGBTQ Task Force. So that's what triggers my work, and I think the fact that I have been blessed to be in a place where I can interact both within the Christian community, but also in a multi-faith setting through such organizations as the National Religious Leadership Roundtable and such, to see my own values being replicated and mirrored by so many thousands of other LGBTQ people.
Exactly. I love that you emphasize that so many of us are people of faith, and Jacob mentioned this as well, is it's not this false binary that people want to present. As I mentioned in the opening, and Jacob touched on in his answers, anti-trans legislation is on the rise in different states throughout the country. How would the Equality Act protect trans people across the United States while so many of our states are failing us?
Well, I'm going to answer it from the standpoint of being here in Minnesota. We have human rights protection since 1993. We were the first state to provide protections for the LGBT community. We included the trans community. And it's an amazing transition that's happened over those years. That's over a generation. Which means that a lot of people in this community have grown up not realizing that there is that they're just accepting the fact that there is protection for their identities or their orientations, and it comes as a mixed blessing because we have such a patchwork in other states. So if you look at the situation that I'm in, if I decide that I want to spend half my year in a southern state as a trans person, the protections that I have in Minnesota don't translate into protections in Georgia or Florida. Basically, I can't even consider going to Rapid City, South Dakota, which is like 600 miles away from me across the border, and expect that if I have a health situation that I'm going to be treated as the same way that a non-trans person would be treated. They don't have those protections. I can't even go across, 20 miles across the border to Wisconsin and have protections. They have LGBT community protections in Wisconsin, but they don't have trans protections. So the fact is, we have this patchwork of protections. 24 states have LGBT protections, but keep in mind that a majority of the states still do not have that. And so we need something like the Equality Act, non-discrimination legislation. The Equality Act is the example at the moment, to protect all of us all of the time so that we can be ourselves all of the time. And I think, the work of the task force is based on making that a reality for the LGBT community. And the fact is that state legislatures across the country right now are deluged with particularly anti-trans legislation. And it's basically based on the fact that most people who are raising those issues don't know a trans person. They don't understand the trans community. They've never met a trans person. So my mantra to people is to tell your story, because if you don't tell your story, you're not going to get the protection and the justice and the equality that you need.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love that. Our stories are so important, and we've heard so much about people promoting these bills who've never met a trans person, don't even know if they're trans people in their states. And And you're right about the patchwork. I live in rural North Carolina. We don't have protections here. So people who are born and raised here aren't protected, let alone people who are traveling for work or pleasure. So thank you so much, Barbara. Those were fantastic answers as always. Let's go to Dr. Sabrina Dent. I am so excited to talk to you. How would you say the Equality Act impacts religious freedom?
Let me first clarify that despite some of the public discourse, the Equality Act does not weaken religious freedom. The Equality Act does not favor a set of religious beliefs over another, and it does not affect the ability of any religious denomination or organization to maintain their beliefs about marriage and sexuality. The Equality Act simply ensures that if these organizations accept federal funds to provide services, they cannot discriminate on the basis of race, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. Simply put, the government should never fund discrimination. Additionally, the Equality Act expands protections for people of faith, women, and many marginalized groups. Thus, this is not a matter of us versus them. This is about all of us. It is about us. People of faith include devoted individuals who are also members of the LGBTQ community. So every person has the right to be, to live, and to thrive in society without the threat of discrimination or harm by religion being misused. And this is why the Equality Act is so important.
Thank you. Yeah, it is about all of us. Religious freedom is a cornerstone of our nation and important for people of faith. But we also know that religious freedom is often used as a tool to discriminate against people, including and especially LGBTQ people. What can people of faith do to both support religious freedom and LGBTQ equality?
I can't remind people enough of what Jacob and Barbara have already said. They said, first of all, that we must remember that there are people of faith who identify with the communities or the groups that are being prioritized in this bill. That is faithful and devoted LGBTQ members of many religious identities and none. And so it's important for us to remember that every person matters. That's the first thing. The other thing is that the Equality Act adds important civil rights protections currently missing in the law for LGBTQ people, women, and marginalized communities. And it's great that the Equality Act would make clear that religious freedom cannot be misused to undermine these protections. So one of the ways people of faith can support religious freedom and LGBTQ equality is to support the Equality Act and another bill that's in Congress, the Do No Harm Act. And so the Do No Harm Act will make sure that people cannot carve out harmful religious exemptions from a broader array of civil rights, healthcare, labor, and other laws that fall outside of the purview of the Equality Act. The Do No Harm Act actually honors two American core values, which are religious freedom and the promise of equal protection of the law. The Do No Harm Act is a federal bill that would ensure that religious freedom is used as a shield to protect religious exercise and not a sword to cause harm to people. In essence, it affirms the human dignity of every person by stating that religion should never be used to cause harm to any person, nor should it prevent any person from having access to the basic necessities for them to thrive as a human being. And so at Americans United, we've been very intentional about this work, and we even created a toolkit to help religious and non-religious communities to learn more about the Do No Harm Act, but also how they can take action by contacting their members of Congress, whether that's through email or through a phone call. But the short thing I want to say, Artie, is that this is why we're here today. We're here because as people of faith, we believe that every human being was made in the image and likeness of the divine, and everyone matters to God, and that every aspect of their personhood matters. So if we truly ascribe to the beliefs that we proclaim, then it's our moral obligation to be agents of hope for our LGBTQ siblings and to support legislation that provides federal protections for them, at the same time allows them to freely live and be themselves.
Thank you. I love that. I was raised Baptist, and the separation of church and state was so ingrained in me growing up. And we see it. We see religion written into law as a protection for discrimination. And thank you so much for that answer, because I think it really addressed that. And in the toolkit for the Do No Harm Act is in the comments on Facebook, so y'all can check that out. Thank you, Dr. Dent. It was a pleasure, and thank you to all three of our fabulous panelists. It's been an honor to moderate this panel of extraordinary leaders in the faith and equality movements. Thank you to those who tuned in and joined us for this important conversation, chatted with us on Facebook. If you'd like to take action, join our powerful network of faith leaders by adding your name to Faith in Public Life's Equality Act petition, which is being dropped in the comments. We hope and pray that your loved ones are safe during this pandemic, and we also want to lift up that we remain in another pandemic of white supremacy and violence against Black and Brown people. So we want to remember that as well and take action where we can. Don't forget to grab your mug and join us April 21st at noon Eastern Time for our conversation on advocating for democracy reform. You can RSVP at the link in the chat. And don't forget to sign and share the Equality Act petition that's in the comments. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.